January 17, 1940, Pearl Harbor Naval Base, Hawaii. The air smelled of salt and diesel fuel. Beneath a gray dawn sky, a small crowd of naval officers gathered on the pier, their polished shoes tapping against damp wooden planks. They had come to witness what many considered an expensive folly, a submarine that promised to revolutionize undersea warfare. It made claims so audacious that even sympathetic ears dismissed them as fantasy. The vessel before them sat low in the water, unremarkable in appearance, its hull painted the standard navy gray. But inside that unassuming shell lay technology that would rewrite the rules of naval combat. Technology that at this moment drew only skepticism and barely concealed ridicule from the gathered brass. The man standing beside the gangway, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey, though he would not take command until later in the war, represented a generation of submariners who believed that silence, not speed, would determine victory in the Pacific. The officers on the pier did not yet understand that they were witnessing the birth of a weapon that would haunt the waters of the Japanese Empire like a ghost. Unseen, unheard, unstoppable. The submarine before them bore the designation USS Tambor, lead boat of her class, and she carried within her pressure hull a revolutionary diesel-electric propulsion system that promised something the old, as boats and their predecessors could never deliver: true stealth. For centuries, naval warfare had been a contest of armor and firepower, of who could strike hardest and fastest. But in the dark depths of the Pacific, where pressure crushed steel and darkness swallowed light, a new paradigm was emerging. The submarine that could move without being detected, that could approach unheard and strike unseen, would hold an advantage no amount of armor could counter. Yet the admirals gathered that morning could not see past their preconceptions. Submarines in their experience were noisy, temperamental machines that announced their presence with the grinding of machinery and the cavitation of propellers. The idea that a vessel displacing 1,500 tons could slip through enemy waters undetected seemed to violate the fundamental laws of physics and common sense. In the months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy found itself in a peculiar position. War with Japan appeared increasingly inevitable, yet the instruments of that war remained untested, unproven. The submarine force, in particular, existed in a state of uncertain transition. The old boats, veterans of the First World War, obsolete, short-ranged, unsuited to the vast distances of the Pacific. The new fleet submarines promised greater range and endurance, but they carried with them experimental systems that made cautious officers nervous. The Mark 14 torpedo, later infamous for its failures, was believed to be the finest undersea weapon ever created. The new Tambor-class boats featured air conditioning. It's previously considered an unnecessary luxury, which would prove essential for maintaining crew effectiveness in tropical waters. And most controversially, they incorporated sound-dampening technologies, rubber mountings for machinery, special propeller designs, insulated hull sections that their designers claimed would make them nearly undetectable to enemy hydrophones. The skeptics had reason for doubt. Every innovation in submarine design had promised revolutionary advantages. Every innovation had revealed unexpected flaws once subjected to the harsh realities of combat. The human cost of these failures was measured in the names of boats that never returned, lost to mechanical failure. 2 enemy depth charges, to the simple fact that undersea warfare remained an unpredictable and merciless domain. To bet America's Pacific strategy on unproven technology seemed, to many experienced officers, an act of dangerous optimism bordering on negligence. Yet the believers persisted, and among them were submariners who understood that the coming war would not be won by conventional thinking. The Japanese Empire controlled vast stretches of ocean, defended by a navy that had spent decades preparing for decisive surface engagements. American submarines would need to operate alone, deep in enemy waters, hunting convoys that supplied Japan's war machine with the raw materials of conquest. For this mission, stealth was not merely an advantage, it was survival itself. The doubters imagined enemy waters as they had always been, surface ships racing toward the sound of torpedoes, destroyers converging on the telltale swirl of a periscope, depth charges raining down on submarines whose every movement betrayed their position. They imagined submarine warfare as a desperate gamble, Short burst of violence followed by a harrowing escape or a tomb of crushed steel. What they could not imagine, standing on that pier in the gray light of dawn, was the transformation that would occur when American submarines became truly silent. They could not envision the psychological terror of merchant captains whose ships suddenly exploded without warning, without any indication that death had been stalking them beneath the waves. They could not foresee the paranoia that would grip Japanese naval officers as their vessels began disappearing from waters they considered secure. Taken by an enemy they could neither see nor hear, the silent submarine would prove to be more than a weapon. It would become a specter, a manifestation of vulnerability that would erode Japanese confidence and strain their naval resources to the breaking point. But in January 1940, these futures remained unwritten. The officers on the pier saw only an untested vessel and expensive claims. They returned to their duties, many of them filing away mental notes of skepticism that would resurface in the months to come. The Tambor completed her sea trials, was commissioned, and joined the fleet. Her sisters followed, Tautog, Thresher, Triton, Trout, Tambor herself, and others, each one carrying forward the promise of silent running. The crews trained, learning to move through their boats with practiced quietness, understanding that every dropped wrench, every slammed hatch, might mean the difference between survival and detection. They practiced approaching targets at periscope depth, cutting their engines to reduce noise, becoming students of an art that had never before been taught. And they waited, as America itself waited, for the moment when theory would collide with reality. When the silent submarines would finally prove their worth or reveal their inadequacy, that moment arrived. On December 7, 1941, with the roar of aircraft engines over Pearl Harbor and the bloom of explosions across Battleship Row in a single morning, the Japanese attack force shattered the illusion of American invulnerability and transformed the Pacific War from an abstract possibility into a burning reality. The battleships that had formed the core of American naval planning lay broken in the harbor's mud. The aircraft carriers that would ultimately decide the war's outcome were at sea, spared by chance, and the submarines, including those dismissed as experimental curiosities, suddenly became the only offensive weapons available to strike back at an enemy that controlled vast stretches of ocean. Within days, American submarines began departing Pearl Harbor on war patrols, heading west into waters dominated by Japanese forces, carrying orders to sink anything flying the flag of the rising sun. The silent hunters were going to war. The early patrols revealed a harsh truth. Stealth technology alone could not guarantee success. The Mark 14 torpedo, that supposed marvel of engineering, proved catastrophically defective. Torpedoes ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath their targets. Magnetic exploders detonated prematurely or failed to detonate at all. Contact exploders crumpled on impact without triggering. Submarine commanders found themselves in perfect attack positions, undetected by the enemy, only to watch their torpedoes malfunction in ways that seemed almost deliberately perverse. The frustration was maddening. To achieve what had been thought impossible, to approach Japanese vessels with impunity, to fire weapons that should have sent enemy ships to the bottom, only to see those ships steam away unharmed, while the submarine slipped away in silent defeat. The technology that had been mocked now worked perfectly, but the weapons themselves had betrayed the men who depended on them. It would take nearly 2 years of combat reports, bureaucratic resistance, and increasingly desperate before the torpedo problems were finally acknowledged and corrected. Yet even with defective torpedoes, the silent submarines began to make their presence felt. The Japanese merchant marine, essential for supplying the far-flung garrisons of the empire, suddenly found itself under attack by an enemy that struck without warning. Cargo ships carrying rubber from Malaya, oil from the East Indies, rice from Indochina, the lifeblood of Japan's war economy, began disappearing. Sometimes the only evidence of an attack was wreckage and survivors in lifeboats, telling confused stories of explosions that came from nowhere, of being torpedoed without ever detecting the submarine's approach. Japanese naval planners had anticipated submarine warfare, but they had expected it to follow familiar patterns. Submarines would be detected, tracked, engaged, and destroyed by the sophisticated anti-submarine forces Japan had developed. What they had not anticipated was submarines that could not be detected, that haunted the sea lanes like invisible predators, striking at will and vanishing without trace. The symbolic reality of this new warfare manifested itself in the growing stacks of patrol reports filed by submarine commanders. Each report told variations of the same story: approach undetected, fire torpedoes, observe results, depart undetected. The enemy never knew they were there. Japanese destroyers raced over the spots where American submarines had just fired, but the submarines had already slipped away into the depths, their silent propulsion systems leaving no trail for enemy hydrophones to follow. The psychological impact on Japanese naval forces was profound and cumulative. How could you fight an enemy you could not find? How could you protect merchant ships when the submarines stalking them left no signature until the moment of attack? The answer, increasingly, was that you could not. The Japanese merchant marine began sailing in heavily escorted convoys, diverting destroyers and patrol craft from other duties, creating a defensive burden that grew heavier as the war progressed. But it was in the specific, the particular, the individual stories of silent submarines striking deep in Japanese-controlled waters, that the true impact of this technological revolution became clear. Consider the night of April 3, 1943, when USS Wahoo, under Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton, penetrated Wewak Harbor on the northern coast of New Guinea. The harbor was supposed to be secure, protected by patrol boats and shore batteries, a safe anchorage for Japanese vessels supplying their garrison. Morton brought Wahoo into the harbor on the surface under cover of darkness, using the silent running capabilities that had been so doubted 3 years earlier. The submarine's electric motors made no more noise than a distant wind. Her whole design minimized the sound of water flowing along her sides. She moved through the harbor like a shadow, undetected by the sleeping vessels anchored in neat rows. At point-blank range, Morton fired a spread of torpedoes by this time. Some of the torpedo problems had been addressed and watched through his periscope as ships began exploding. Before the Japanese could respond, Wahoo slipped back out to sea, leaving chaos and burning ships behind. The action report that Morton filed was matter-of-fact in its language, but the implications were staggering. An American submarine had penetrated a defended Japanese harbor, sunk multiple ships, and escaped without being detected until the moment of attack, or consider USS Temps under Richard O'Kane, perhaps the finest submarine commander of the Pacific War. Kane understood instinctively what the early skeptics had failed to grasp. That silence was not merely about avoiding detection, but about controlling the tactical situation. A silent submarine could approach to optimal range before firing, could maneuver without alerting the target, could create multiple attack opportunities from a single approach. In the fall of 1944, during Tang's Fifth War Patrol, Kane took his boat into the Formosa Strait, one of the most heavily trafficked and well-defended waterways in the Japanese Empire. Over the course of several nights, Tang stalked a convoy, firing, repositioning, firing again, using her silent running capability to remain undetected, even as Japanese destroyers searched frantically for the submarine that was systematically destroying their charges. The convoy lost ship after ship, freighters, tankers, transports, each one sinking with its cargo of supplies that would never reach Japanese forces fighting in the Philippines. The escorts could hear the explosions, could see ships dying, but they could not find the hunter. Tang's engines remained silent. Her crew moved through the boat with practiced stealth, and she continued killing until her torpedoes were expended, the symbolic object that recurs throughout. These stories is not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but something more subtle: the hydrophone recording. Japanese naval bases maintained extensive records of underwater sounds, attempting to catalog the acoustic signatures of American submarines. But the recordings captured by Japanese hydrophone operators told a disturbing story. In the early days of the war, American submarines could be heard from considerable distance: the rumble of diesel engines, the whine of electric motors, the distinctive cavitation of propellers. But as the war progressed, these signatures grew fainter, harder to detect. The new American submarines, especially the late-war Gato and Balao classes that incorporated all the lessons learned from early designs, produced acoustic profiles so minimal the Japanese operators sometimes dismissed them as biological noise, mistaking the approach of a submarine for the sound of whales or tidal currents. The recordings became symbols of technological inadequacy, evidence that Japan was losing not just a numerical race, but a qualitative one, that American submarines were operating at a level of stealth that Japanese anti-submarine forces could not counter. This acoustic superiority had roots in American industrial culture that went deeper than mere engineering. The United States had spent decades developing technologies for industries that demanded precision and quality control: automobile manufacturing, aviation, refrigeration, radio production. The same expertise that created automobiles that ran smoothly and quietly translated directly into submarine machinery that operated with minimal vibration and noise. The rubber mountings that isolated machinery from the hull came from the same rubber industry that produced tires. The precision bearings that allowed propellers to spin without cavitation came from factories that made components for aircraft engines. The sound-dampening materials that lined submarine compartments were developed by companies that manufactured insulation for commercial buildings. American industrial abundance manifested itself not just in the number of submarines produced. The United States would build more than 200 fleet submarines during the war, but in the quality of their construction, the sophistication of their systems, the attention to details that made them genuinely silent. When they encountered captured American boats or studied wreckage recovered from sunken submarines, were struck by the comprehensiveness of American sound reduction efforts. It was not one or two clever innovations, but a systematic approach to every source of noise. Machinery mounted on rubber, propellers designed with mathematical precision to minimize turbulence, hull sections insulated with sound-absorbing materials. Even the deck plating was designed to dampen footsteps. This thoroughness reflected an industrial philosophy fundamentally different from Japanese practice, which emphasized simplicity and ease of manufacture. American submarines were complex, expensive, and difficult to build, but they were also extraordinarily effective. The industrial abundance that produced them was itself a form of psychological warfare. Every silent submarine that appeared in Japanese waters was a reminder that America could afford to build weapons of surpassing sophistication, that the industrial gap between the two nations was not merely quantitative, but qualitative. The emotional contrast between expectation and reality defined the experience of Japanese naval officers who faced these silent submarines. They had expected to fight a submarine war similar to what they had studied from the Second World War and the European theater submarines that could be detected, tracked, and destroyed through systematic application of anti-submarine doctrine. What they found instead was an enemy that violated their assumptions, that appeared and disappeared without warning, that turned the act of sailing through open water into a nerve-wracking gamble. Merchant captains who survived submarine attacks spoke of the terror of knowing that death might be approaching beneath them at any moment. Invisible and unstoppable, naval officers tasked with protecting convoys grew increasingly frustrated as their sophisticated detection equipment failed to locate submarines that everyone knew were present. The psychological burden grew heavier as the war progressed and losses mounted. By 1944, the Japanese merchant marine had been effectively crippled, not through overwhelming numbers of submarines. The American submarine force numbered fewer than 200 boats at its peak, but through the cumulative effect of silent, relentless predation. The transformation in American submarine tactics reflected this growing confidence. Early in the war, submarine commanders had been cautious, conservative, trained to avoid detection at all costs and to escape immediately after attacking. But as the evidence of their stealth accumulated, as patrol after patrol returned with reports of undetected approaches and clean escapes, tactics became more aggressive. Commanders began penetrating harbors, attacking in broad daylight, surfacing to pursue damaged ships, engaging in surface gun actions with smaller vessels. The silent running capability that had been mocked in 1940 had given American submarines a degree of tactical freedom that fundamentally altered the nature of undersea warfare. They were no longer forced to strike and run, no longer purely defensive in their approach. They had become hunters, in the truest sense, capable of stalking their prey with patience and precision, striking when conditions were optimal, and doing so with near impunity. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 illustrated how American submarines had evolved into strategic weapons capable of affecting major naval engagements. As the Japanese fleet moved to intercept American carriers, American submarines formed a picket line across their path. The submarines did not need to sink every Japanese ship. They needed only to report enemy movements and attack when opportunities arose. The silent submarines tracked the Japanese fleet for hours, radioing position reports while remaining undetected. When opportunities for attack presented themselves, submarines struck. Albacore torpedoed the carrier Taiho, damaging her so severely that she later sank from gasoline vapor explosions. Kavala sank the carrier Shikaku, one of the veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack. These attacks were made possible by the submarine's ability to approach undetected and maintain contact without being located. The Japanese fleet never realized how completely they were being shadowed, how transparently their movements were being reported to American commanders. The silent submarines had become not just weapons, but intelligence assets of incalculable value. By late 1944, American submarines operated in Japanese waters with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They surfaced to recharge batteries within sight of Japanese shores. They engaged patrol craft with deck guns. They rescued downed American pilots from waters the Japanese considered their own. The USS Barb under Commander Eugene Fluckey, the same officer who had observed the early skepticism, in 1940 conducted a mission so audacious it seems almost fictional. Fluckey landed a shore party on the Japanese home island of Hokkaido, where they placed explosive charges on a coastal railroad track, derailing a train. An American submarine crew had literally attacked Japan itself. And they did so because the silent submarine technology gave them the freedom to operate even in waters that should have been most heavily defended. The psychological impact of such operations on Japanese morale was devastating. If American submarines could strike with impunity, even in home waters, what hope remained of defending the far-flung possessions of the empire? The statistical evidence tells a story of systematic destruction. American submarines sank approximately 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, totaling more than 5 million tons of shipping. They destroyed roughly 30% of the Japanese Navy's warships, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. These losses crippled Japan's ability to wage war. The oil from the East Indies never reached Japanese refineries. The rubber from Malaya never reached Japanese factories. The food from conquered territories never reached Japanese civilians. The reinforcements destined for island garrisons never arrived, leaving troops to face American invasions with dwindling supplies and no hope of relief. The silent submarines, operating alone or in small groups, achieved strategic effects that required massive fleets in surface warfare. They did so not through overwhelming force, but through the systematic exploitation of technological superiority, specifically the ability to operate undetected in waters enemy considered secure. The recurring symbol throughout this campaign was the sound of silence itself. Japanese survivors of submarine attacks often reported that they never heard the submarine approach, never detected any indication of danger before the torpedo struck. This silence became legendary, discussed in hushed tones among merchant mariners who knew that their next voyage might be their last. It appeared in Japanese naval communications, which increasingly referred to invisible submarines and ghost boats. It haunted the nightmares of sailors who understood that death might be approaching beneath them at any moment, and they would have no warning until the explosion came. The silence was more than an absence of sound. It was the presence of fear, the manifestation of technological inadequacy, the reminder that Japan was fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity and scientific sophistication far exceeded their own. For the American submariners who manned these silent boats, the experience transformed their understanding of war and their role in it. They had expected to be participants in a desperate struggle, outnumbered and vulnerable. Instead, they found themselves wielding a weapon of extraordinary power, capable of striking with near impunity. The pride they felt in their boats and their capabilities was tempered by the recognition that they were engaged in a form of warfare that allowed no mercy, no second chances. A merchant ship sunk in the middle of the Pacific meant hundreds of men in the water, most of whom would not survive. The submariners justified this carnage with the knowledge that those merchant ships carried the materials of war, that every ship sunk weakened Japan's ability to continue fighting, that the silent submarines were helping to end a war that Japan had started. But the moral weight remained, carried in silent moments between patrols. In the faces of men who had watched through periscopes as ships burned and men died, the epilogue of this story is written in the ruins of the Japanese merchant marine and the transformed nature of naval warfare. When the war ended in August 1945, the Japanese merchant fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war strength. The elaborate convoy system that Japan had established could not protect ships from submarines that struck without warning and vanished without trace. The acoustic superiority of American submarines had proven decisive, validating the investments in sound reduction technology that had seemed so questionable in 1940. The officers who had scoffed at the silent sub were no longer around to acknowledge their ere many had died at Pearl Harbor or in subsequent battles, but the vindication was complete nonetheless. The silent submarine had proven to be one of the most effective weapons of the Pacific War, achieving strategic effects disproportionate to the resources invested in it. But the legacy of the silent submarine extends beyond World War II. Beyond the specific tactical and strategic successes in the Pacific, it represents a vindication of a particular approach to military technology, one that prioritizes quality and sophistication over simplicity and quantity. The American submarines were not easy to build, not simple to operate. They required highly trained crews, extensive support infrastructure, continuous maintenance. They were expensive, both in terms of direct costs and in terms of the industrial resources required to produce them. But they worked. They achieved their mission. They justified the faith of the men who believed that stealth would determine victory in undersea warfare. In doing so, they established principles that continue to govern submarine design to this day. That silence is the submarine's greatest asset. That the ability to operate undetected provides tactical and strategic advantages that no amount of firepower can replace. That the investment in subduction technology yields dividends far exceeding its cost. The story of the silent submarine is ultimately a story about the relationship between technology, tactics, and industrial capacity. The technology worked because American industry could produce the precision components required for truly quiet machinery. The tactics evolved because commanders understood how to exploit the advantages that silence provided. And the industrial capacity made it possible to build enough submarines to wage a systematic campaign against Japanese shipping. All three elements were necessary. Any one alone would have been insufficient. The skeptics who mocked the silent submarine in 1940 were not fools. They were men who understood that technology often promises more than it delivers, that innovations frequently reveal unexpected flaws under combat conditions. They were right to be skeptical, but they were wrong in their assessment, and their error cost them the understanding of a weapon that would help decide the war's outcome in the cold waters off Tokyo Bay. In the tropical heat of the South Pacific, in the narrow straits and harbors of the Japanese Empire, American submarines moved through the darkness like whispers. They were heard only when they chose to be heard. In the moment of attack, when torpedoes left their tubes and raced toward unsuspecting targets, the rest of the time, they were silent, invisible, undetectable exactly as their designers had promised, exactly as their commanders had hoped, exactly as the skeptics had thought impossible. They proved that silence could be a weapon as powerful as any gun. That stealth could achieve victories that brute force could not. That in the dark depths of the ocean, the ability to move unseen and unheard was the ultimate advantage. The officers who scoffed at the silent submarine learned this lesson too late, if they learned it at all. But history learned it and remembered. And the principles established by those silent hunters continue to shape naval warfare in an age when submarines have become even more sophisticated, even more deadly, and even more silent than the boats that haunted the waters of Imperial Japan and helped bring an empire to its knees.